Yeah, last semester I got it was yeah, and then when I got home, my mom told me I had no idea what she talking about. And then she told me that my roommate's mother found her on Facebook. And so telling her about all the questions. Yeah, I never like complained for it was pretty good. I remember did you? I think I've seen someone before. But I don't know. It's the way you like. I decided to run with them because I'm not going to come to me. What else am I going to do? Whatever. I said, it wasn't that. It's not that fun. They're really fun.
Yes.
Like the weather we have right now is like 77 and like over 49. That's what's like in winter. So it's just weird. It's just colder in here. It doesn't just stay like I kind of just want to go to the Midwest. In Florida, even just getting down Florida, it takes me like 6-7 hours. So like, yeah, I'm more than Miami. Like, if Florida is like this, then kind of just like, and that's Miami, and that's over here, and that's and I got a good scholarship here. So you might as well. You just want to get very similar. But honestly, now that I've decided where I want my career, I'm so not happier than just.
This is about 11 o'clock, ladies and gentlemen. Before we start with the material, just two very quick things. Remember, starting on this Friday, we're starting with the second set of presentations. Again, as with the first presentation, feel free to take advantage of my help to the degree that you want it. Do remember, of course, everyone is going for a second time. So feel free to email me or come to office hours if you have questions about resources as we begin to work through. And hopefully the first group, the sixth group, actually, the group that's going on Friday, has already started with that process. The other thing just to keep in the back of your head, although it's not an immediate emergency, is remember a week from today you'll be having your second midterm. So just remember that it's there. The second midterm I'll also, it seemed to work out pretty well last time. I'll just give this one on Blackboard 2. I will give you more time now. I'll give you 100 minutes this time because I noticed that some people seem to struggle with the time. So hopefully with a little bit extra time, it'll be a little bit easier. I'll give you more time to write. Okay, so this one I'll give you 100 minutes. The format otherwise will be exactly the same. And everything, the second slice of the class from India through Japan. We won't, of course, hit these classes on Monday, but just keep it in the back of your head. Concentrate on it. All right, today what we're going to be talking about is really the last of our lectures about Imperial China. And this is the period in which the Chinese, for a certain amount of time, are going to lose control of their government. And they're going to lose it to this new group of people who are going to burst onto the scene, both in China and many different parts of the world, known as the Mongols. And the Mongols, to some degree, we said before, the Chinese had lived long in a situation in which they were afraid of barbarian outsiders coming and attacking their civilization. So that, in fact, is absolutely nothing new. Really, the only difference with the Mongols is the level of success they had fighting against the Chinese, to the point where they would actually end up destroying the old Imperial Chinese dynasty and founding their own. We think that initially, just to give you some idea of the kind of territories that this new group, the Mongols, came from, this is an area kind of known as steppe land. Steppe land, as you can see here, area that in many cases is not very good for farming. In many cases, you just get just kind of like these brushes. Really, in some ways, this kind of territory that is terribly inhospitable and not half as attractive as many of the territories that Mongols would one day conquer. We think Mongols come from Central Asia, and initially they are clearly a nomadic group, constantly on the move, and very devoted, more than anything else, to their families, members of their families, members of their more extended clan. But in our terms, they didn't have anything like developed government until they start to conquer places that do. That's when they really begin to reconsider that notion. Really, the person who is most important in this process is someone whose name you should already know. This is a portrait of Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan, we think, his real genius was to take this group, this nomadic group that previously had been scattered into all sorts of different clans, managed to bring them together into one sort of super clan where everyone was fighting under an emperor, him. Really, by that means, take their sort of fierce fighting culture and turn it to where it can be most effective. And altogether, what that's going to lead to is an empire that is both powerful in size and absolutely huge, the largest land empire that the world can ever see. Things started much more modestly, though, as most often do. And Genghis Khan, as we've seen before in many cases, the Genghis Khan is actually not the person's birth name. It's actually a title he's only awarded midway through his career. The term Genghis is something that means oceanic. More or less, it means that he rules from ocean to ocean. Khan is a term that Mongols traditionally use to describe a general. And in fact, Khan is not anything, was not actually unusual as a term up until that point. Except that once Genghis comes to power, he's going to call himself the Great Khan. Khan is above all of the other Khans that Mongols have, the other generals. We think that, so Genghis Khan's birth name is Temujin, which you'll still see some sources you read for today. And Temujin came from a family that was actually well placed among the Mongols. It was a noble family. But like other Mongol families, he, from a young age, would learn the art of fighting, art of riding on horseback. The Mongols were fantastic at riding on horseback. Mongols were fantastic at shooting arrows on horseback. In fact, in many cases, attacking from a distance before they came to close quarters with people. Now, it's hard to, now we think that Genghis Khan, I'll call him Genghis Khan, because it makes my life easier. Genghis Khan, even from a young age, probably was poised to be someone who's very important among the Mongols, because his father had already been a very successful leader. Actually, we think his father, even before him, got the idea that maybe he would be the one to bring together a lot of Mongols into one group. Alas, though, his father will die when Genghis Khan is still young, he's still 10. And his father, as Mongols would often do, whenever they ran into another clan and they saw another clan leader, clan leaders would actually exchange food with one another as a sign of mutual trust and friendship. Their drink of choice, and I really kid you not, fermented mare's milk was what they were into. If you've never tried it, well, neither have I, and I probably won't, but that's really what they used to get drunk on. In any case, both Genghis Khan's father and this other clan leader exchanged this drink, and just so it turned out that someone had slipped poison into Genghis' father's drink, and he died very soon after. Genghis Khan, however, will not, and really at this point he lived a very precarious existence because he was really too young yet to raise an entire clan to himself. And some of his father's old enemies actually begin to attack him. And so he actually, at one point, he gets captured by another clan, he has to escape. Very quickly, he has to learn to think on his feet, try to gain friends wherever possible. He becomes very clever. Please.
Did you say that his father died from the milk, not him? Okay.
Precisely. No, Genghis Khan was fine. He was endangered for other reasons, but the poison didn't touch him. So in some ways, really living among Mongols who don't like you is a very good training for the world. And specifically, how the Mongol society worked. He got a very good introduction to that at a young age. We think that Genghis Khan, as he begins to get a little bit older, he begins to become known for displays of bravery in battle, which means that more and more independent Mongols would begin to rise to calls to join up with him. And we think that Genghis Khan, by this point, as even in young adulthood, already had mastered how diplomacy works among the Mongols. When you think someone's going to help you, you join up with them, you create allies. When you think someone's useless to you, you cut them loose, and you let them be destroyed. And he becomes very good at this game, and slowly begins to cobble together a considerable army. And one of the real strengths that Genghis Khan had as a leader was that he managed to take many Mongol groups who previously refused to ally with anyone, and he actually has them, brings them into his new coalition. He brings them into his side. And we think that the more Genghis Khan manages to, the more people he gets in his army, the more he begins to attack other Mongol groups, destroy their leaders, and then take over their armies completely. So success builds upon itself. Until finally, an assembly of Mongol leaders will all come together, and then they'll actually give him the title Genghis Khan, and they'll proclaim him then universal leader among Mongols, a title that had never existed before. The Mongols are going to have an emperor. Now, we think that as soon as this happens, as soon as Genghis Khan gets put in this position as king, he has to act quickly. These people are not putting him into power just to sit on the throne. They want real results from his ascension, and that's what they get. Quickly, Genghis begins to reorganize the entire army. He sees that one of the real weaknesses the Mongols have had up until this point is they always fight among members of their own family clan. And the problem with that is that whenever they're endangered, sometimes people will favor the interests of people of their own clan rather than think about the army as a whole. And so sometimes people were, for instance, will abandon an army together with their family members. Genghis begins to completely break up that old organization. He creates an army now that has that's really organized entirely by this sort of random sort of juggling up of different soldiers, so that you don't see people together with fighting only with people of their own clan now. Their only loyalty is supposed to be to him, not to anyone else. We also think Genghis Khan is a very good judge of talent. You could see if someone was going to be a good sub-leader, to be a good general. And so he really chooses men very well for those positions. Now, you may still see to yourself, and that's actually a logical point, how can the Mongols, and these people who really cannot have had all that many people population-wise, how can they really conquer much of anything? The answer to that is, yes, you're actually right. The Mongols did not have a huge population, but it's basically the entire male population of the Mongols were in the army. Basically, everyone was drafted. And so this army has around 125,000 people. Essentially, Mongol males are in the army. As I mentioned to you, Mongols, as soon as they can walk, they learn how to ride a horse. The equestrian skills were high. They had to do all sorts of skills when they were younger. Going out hunting, for instance, to be able to improve these skills. All sorts of games on horseback. And they were very good at using bow and arrows. They were highly mobile. Their armies moved extremely fast and maneuvered well on the battlefield. They fought in battles. On top of that, we think early Mongol armies made a point of absolutely eliminating everyone in their path. You may think that this is something genocidal, really, especially in the early battles. But the point was that they wanted to strike fear into everybody. And they actually had this psychological edge over many of the people they fought against. Because if you went to the Mongols and you surrendered immediately, they would give you pretty good terms. They certainly would allow you to keep their lives. And in fact, especially if you had any kind of skill they wanted, someone who could fight for them, someone who could build things, they would leave you alive and they'd put you to work. If, however, you were foolish enough to take the field against Mongols, they would show no mercy. They would kill everybody in the battles. So you had to really weigh for yourself if you thought you had an actual chance. And in many cases, later people would just say, forget it. And they would lay down their arms and they would surrender. Once Genghis Khan united the Mongols, he quickly begins to turn to other parts of Central and then even further East Asia. He first of all managed to get rid of any other nomadic groups who he felt might threaten him in any way. So the other, we went east, of course, Central Asia had long been this place where all sorts of nomadic groups existed. He gets rid of all their leaders very quickly. And then he begins to look for the great prize. And we've talked for several sessions about how rich Imperial China was. And in fact, the Mongols were well aware of this. And that's why one of their first stops on their tour of destruction is to go right after Imperial China. And I told you, in fact, just by accident, they had chosen a fantastic time to attack China because the Sung Dynasty didn't have much of a military count to them. So this was the right time to take China, if you ever had to choose a time. We think that this army begins, as most of these armies that attack China, to attack in the north. Little by little, it begins to infiltrate further and further into China. And really, we don't think initially Mongols had any desires to actually serve as a new sort of government or take over China. But it was actually a little easier than they had anticipated, destroying the Chinese army and government. And so, in fact, in time, they switched from position of just being people who are going to pillage and take things with them, and they actually begin to take over the army, take over the government entirely. And in fact, even from this early stage, as they're still wreaking havoc in China, they also send off other armies further into the west as well. So in effect, some of these territories that, again, to the west of Central Asia, all of this territory here will also very quickly turn a full against their advance, all the way again to some of these Muslim territories in the Middle East. Areas like Eastern Europe and Russia fall very quickly, Afghanistan, Iran, all of these territories are on their hit list. And really, wherever they go, the pattern is depressingly similar. The Mongols really come in with a burst of force. They slaughter people indiscriminately. In some cases, they'll demolish cities. And again, they leave all these sources that talk about this, the absolute destruction in their wake. This was not, again, in part the destruction, of course, is to property, but we also think in terms of one of the things I've only recognized recently as people have begun to study DNA and taken the DNA of some of these areas that have been conquered by the Mongols. We realized just how much rape there was going on in this as part of this conquest as well. Nowadays, we're able to locate the Y chromosome of some of the people in these territories. Around 16 million descendants of Genghis Khan or his immediate family, which means that in some cases, of course, this may have been willingly sleeping with them, but not many, probably. We're talking about that this is part of their legacy as well. Altogether, we think that by the time of his death, Genghis Khan had laid the foundation for a vast and mighty empire. But one thing he does not have, and this should of course remind you of some earlier conquerors we've seen, Genghis never really had a plan for a government because that had never really been the plan. It's only later on that Mongol leaders begin to recognize, oh my God, we have all this territory, what do we do with it now? So basically what happens. We think that although Genghis Khan was certainly the person who gets the ball rolling, it's not till one of his grandsons, shown here, his name is Kublai Khan. He really manages to consolidate many of these new territories that the Mongols own and figure out more increasingly how to deal with them. Certainly, Kublai Khan was the most talented of Genghis Khan's descendants. One of the reasons why he's able to carry on this role. To some degree, Kublai Khan, and again, as the grandson of Genghis Khan, raised in this warrior culture, does not really differ in many ways from Genghis, in that he too keeps on these absolutely ruthless attacks, both in China and then further to the west. So that, in fact, is a very consistent policy. If there's something different, though, about Kublai Khan, it's that as he has more time in charge, he actually begins to make noises about improving the welfare of his subjects, which is something that never crossed the mind of Genghis Khan at all. He actually distributes free money and grain to the poor in some of the territories that he takes. He does projects that sound to us very close to like Imperial Chinese projects. For instance, he builds roads and maintains roads and communication paths. This helps military, but it just helps people generally too. Interestingly enough, too, we think that we really see Kublai Khan, perhaps even more than other emperors in the Mongol territory, very much embracing a policy of tolerance when it came to religion of their subjects. Now, their tolerance for resistance does not reach very high when it comes to matters of politics or military. If you choose to fight back against the Mongols, they're going to destroy you. When it comes, though, to personal life choices like religion, the Mongols were a pre-modern empire, surprisingly tolerant in some ways. We know, for instance, many of traditional Mongols did not hold to any of the major world religions that we've talked about in this class. Traditional Mongols holds this faith known as Shamanism. This is a modern-day example of one of the priests of this religion, as a shaman. Shamans are these kind of priest-like authorities, and they can go into these mystical trances, more or less, in which they can send their soul outside their bodies, and then with their soul, they can communicate with all sorts of spirits and gods. The Mongols in particular have a lot of gods that relate to nature. So those are some of the gods that are important to them. And especially having to do with the sky, which is why shamans are always shown in blue to communicate with the sky. And so when the shamans are in this mystical state, it is believed that these kind of communications with spirits will ultimately help the Mongols. Now, I told you all of that as a precursor to saying that many Mongols will remain, they'll keep this traditional religion, even as they begin to conquer all sorts of other places. However, many Mongols will be attracted by some of the religions of places that they conquer. So, in fact, we have reports of some Mongols enter China and they are impressed by Taoism. It doesn't seem like an obvious fit, but they actually converted to Taoism. Other Mongols will convert to Buddhism. Some Mongols will convert to Islam. Some Mongols will become Christian. And in fact, all of these religions were completely tolerated within their empire. It didn't make a difference to that period, to the Mongol leaders. The end process of all of this relentless attack of the Mongol emperors on China was that in time the Sung dynasty will shrink to almost nothing and finally be absolutely eliminated. And this is when Kublai Khan will then actually just come in and proclaim himself now the emperor of Imperial China and start what is known as the Yuan Dynasty. It starts with a Y. And the Yuan Dynasty is for all intents and purposes, this is the Mongol dynasty. I should say that we don't really think that the Mongols were, even after they take China, they felt that they were finished conquering in East Asia. They actually do begin to attack slightly further to the south as well, especially in Vietnam. But they really did like fighting in Vietnam in many ways. The Mongols' attack was meant for a very sort of a very broad kind of field is where they worked best. And when the Mongols march into Vietnam, they find they have to all of a sudden adapt to fighting in jungles, which is much more difficult. And they couldn't actually find even enough territory to be able to graze their horses, which annoyed them as well. And many of the natives began to use guerrilla attacks against the Mongols, which they found terribly unsporting. And eventually they abandoned their attempts to take Vietnam. I'll talk more about this later too, but the Mongols actually, although they're generally a land-based people, they also do make two attempts, I should say, at conquering Japan. I'll talk more about this when we talk about Japan, but they both fail. They are not really well suited to naval warfare. And really, some of the territories in which the Mongols in later years begin to really have the most amount of success comes in areas of Eastern Europe and Iran, where in fact they stay, especially in Eastern Europe, the Mongols will stay in power for centuries after the fact because there's no one who really is strong enough to drive them out. Now, as I mentioned to you earlier, while Mongols found it really easy to crush all sorts of regimes militarily, the transition to one of governors was not one that was really easy for them. And they really have a lot of trouble becoming administrators in any sense. And this was especially true in China, which, as we said, had a long tradition now of government, a strong government. And we think initially when the Mongols burst into China, they tend to stand aloof from most of their new subjects. They think that they basically make fun of the Chinese. They say, you guys are a bunch of peasants who really are fit to work the land and nothing else. They forbade Mongols to marry Chinese women because they said they're basically beneath us. They also forbade the Chinese from learning the Mongol language, so they can make fun of the Chinese in their presence without them knowing what they're talking about, which is just a little rude. In any case, we think that at least some of the early, especially Genghis Khan, supposedly, he had actually said that what we should really do with the Chinese is we should just exterminate the entire country, and then we can use all of this land as pasture land for our horses. That should be a better thing. And supposedly one of his men said, "But sir, think of all the money we would lose in taxes." And then Genghis Khan said, "Okay, fine, we will not kill all the Chinese." Yeah, none of these people take a very high value on human life, we might say altogether, but time goes wrong, what can I tell you? As I mentioned to you earlier, we do think that in many cases, the Mongols were smart enough to recognize that if they couldn't do government, some of their subject peoples could. We really do think that all sorts of foreign administrators, anyone who really had the ability to do a job for them, the Mongols very happily embrace. You know, as people who knew how to keep taxes or collect taxes. Anyone who had a skill, like for instance, like how to be a translator, a doctor, people who knew how to work metal, in some cases, soldiers. In any case, all these sort of specialized skills that they discovered among their subjects, the Mongols weren't choosing. They would very happily pay money to foreigners to work for them if they were competent, and they often did. You should also not necessarily think that everything about the Mongols' sort of presence was negative, even in China. And what's actually very interesting to us is that you may not anticipate this at first, but having this huge Mongol presence would wipe out so many people on the route, the Silk Road, going from China to the Mediterranean, and having one dominant military force essentially scared people, like who traditionally would have preyed upon merchants, because they would have to answer the Mongols, who wanted merchants because they recognized merchants bring money. You can tax merchants. So, in effect, many merchants now live under the protection of Mongols, and their numbers begin to increase significantly. Because now you could very easily travel between China and all of these other territories with the blessing of these new dominant figures. And we know, for instance, that the Mongols will continue to mint coins exactly as all the Imperial Chinese dynasties had, because they wanted people spending money so they could tax them. We also, and they also continue, you can see here, as I mentioned to you earlier, they continue to make paper money as well, as we had seen before in Imperial China. In many cases, we can get some idea of just how many goods were traveling back and forth along the Silk Road. Occasionally, sort of items like this, these sort of ivory things, China will pop up hundreds of miles in the west. Chinese porcelain begins to get out from China at a much larger rate than ever before. I like this particular example. This is an Armenian bishop. And if you look very closely, you'll see in his outer vestment, you'll see actually this is a Chinese dragon that is on it. That again, this initially came from China and eventually worked its way again thousands of miles to the west. So we do have some sign of the fact that trading has picked up considerably during this time period. So had diplomacy. The Mongols, again, they're very good at conquering things, but they were smart enough to recognize that diplomacy could be a much faster way to take care of business at times, to get people to surrender quickly. And so the Mongols keep up this very lively communication with all sorts of diplomatic groups who will come into the court of the Mongol emperor. To give you just one of many examples, there was a man known as William of Rubrik. William actually comes from what today is modern-day Belgium. And interestingly enough, he was a Franciscan. And this just gives a portion of his journey from the Mediterranean, and it goes all the way to the capital city of the Mongols. And we think that his expedition was funded by the King of France, who wanted seemingly this Franciscan to collect as much information as possible about the Mongols, because there was fear in the West that eventually they would attack Western Europe. They never do, but there was fear. William, however, was a Franciscan, and he figured that this was a great opportunity to be able to convert people to Christianity on his travel. There was a big problem, however, that William begins to run into on this front, which is to say he did not know any of the languages of these territories that he was traveling in. And here was someone who was extremely eloquent in his own native tongue, Latin, but unfortunately he had to go through a translator who apparently did not know any theological terms. There's a little bit of a problem altogether in trying to convince people of the worth of Christianity as a whole. The translator also would regularly get drunk, which would limit his effectiveness even further. In any case, we see William actually makes it all the way to the capital of the emperor. He has to sort of observe the emperor's feelings and everything. And while he's there, and this is actually very interesting, the emperor decides that he is going to hold a debate among members of 3 different religions. William, of course, is on the Christian side. And then there's actually a group of Muslims who are also at the court, and they have to debate. And there also is a group of Taoists as well. They all have to sort of state their position. Supposedly, the emperor is going to choose whichever religion he likes best. All of this really does not work out very well, because translation issues make this a very slow debate, to say the least bit. It's also fair to say the Christians and the Muslims begin to gang up on the Taoists, who don't really have this level of theological sophistication that Christians and Muslims do. So they can kind of get blown out of the water. What's so interesting about this whole thing is that this is probably the only place in the world at the time that this kind of religious debate could have actually occurred. Most places it really would never have been thinkable. And here's just one of the many letters of the Mongols that was sent by diplomats into the West. We tend to see soon after the death of Kublai Khan, there is a decline in the Mongols' empire in China for many different reasons. The Mongols, for instance, had grown a little bit too greedy in printing paper money. And in fact, there was not enough backing up that money. In fact, their money tends to become worthless at a certain point. We also tend to think, too, that later Mongol leaders in the court are going to spend so much time fighting among themselves that there's basically a small sort of war going on among Mongol leaders. None of them want to submit to any of the others in later generations, which creates a real vacuum in leadership. The other problem, and this is one we'll see later on when we talk about Western Europe, I told you how great it was that the Mongols will open up all of this new territory to trade. And it was in many ways. One of the other problems that this creates is that one of the things that Mongols and other merchants will take with them and bring back to China is the plague. Plague which will travel through small mammals, rats, other mammals. They end up actually causing a huge plague both in Western Europe, which we'll talk about later. And in fact, the plague, although it's much less studied, it also hits China as well. In fact, will kill off a large number of people and already make people a little who already didn't like the Mongols even less happy with their leadership. This is going to cause severe depopulation in China and labor shortages. Finally, also, too, and this is something we've seen before, you can imagine, especially as the Chinese see that there are all these leadership difficulties, which native Chinese always hated the Mongols because the Mongols had treated them like dirt for so long. And so as the first sign of weakness by the Mongols, there are huge revolts by the native Chinese who want to get rid of them as soon as possible. Either because their energy was so sapped from internal battles with one another, or simply because these new Mongol leaders had lived off the fat of the land for so long. They weren't able to mount a successful defense of their territory against the Chinese. The native Chinese actually managed to attack them very quickly and very hard. And eventually the Mongols' response is like, we did not sign up for this. We really wanted to live off the China, but we don't want to deal with its difficulties. So what they did, many Mongol leaders get on their horses and they ride right back out to Central Asia. And they abandoned China when they feel they can no longer hold on to it. The end result of all of this is that, in fact, China, which really, again, had now been under the control of Mongols for some time, is going to be open again to a new native dynasty coming in. This dynasty, which really in this class, because of its dates, we're not going to talk much about it. This is known as the Ming Dynasty. Now, if you were sort of an armchair observer of all this, you might think to yourself, if I had lost my entire country to a group of nomads, maybe there was some sort of fundamental weakness that had to be remedied once this new native dynasty comes into power. But if this is what you thought, you in fact would be wrong. As soon as the Ming get back into power, the attitude is not, okay, we have to change our ways to make sure that no one can ever do this again. People like the Mongols can never come to charge. Instead, what we really see, what's interesting about the Ming Dynasty is that they double down on tradition. In fact, the argument they use is much different from the argument perhaps someone's trying to learn from the past. In essence, what they say is that the problem was that we have not held strongly enough to our own traditions, to the own sort of things that we've done in the past. And so the response to the conquest of the Mongols is that we have to go back to what we had before in terms of the government. There's some Confucian sort of ideas here about sort of going back to the past and the golden age and everything. But here, this has very real consequences. So, for instance, this new Chinese dynasty, the Ming, will basically recreate the same old tax machinery that existed before the Mongols. They will have the same examination system that will choose people to serve as officials for the government. We think that for the vast majority of people, life tended to really, in some ways, be absolutely the same. Certainly, for most peasants in China, there's only the difference would have been who you send your taxes to. There's no fundamental change. And in fact, really, if the Chinese already were a little xenophobic, they really didn't like outsiders much. This actually confirmed everyone's worst fears. The attitude became, look what happened when a bunch of these outsiders came in, look how we were treated. At this point, the Chinese increasingly repudiate any foreign ways and say that we have to look to our own traditions and ignore the rest of the world. And so very often the attitude is to cut off contact with people outside of East Asia entirely. And they said they had nothing to gain from the outsiders, from barbarians. So what's actually interesting to us as historians is that some people would say the Mongol time in China is much more important for outside civilizations rather than China itself. Why? Because some of those great innovations that had been generated in China that took a long time to reach the outside world, it was really under the Mongol domination that they really make it out. Things we've talked about in last class, the compass, the printing press, gunpowder, all of these will spread by merchants, first to Muslim and then eventually Christian territories. And it's unclear how fast they would have made it out without Mongols being in charge. All of these things existed and continue to exist in China, but they were used to reinforce the same system that had always existed. So yes, they had the printing press, but it was used to print the same exact works as in previous times. Gunpowder, when the Chinese learned to use it more effectively, it tends to be used by the emperor to destroy any rebels or people who go against their power. The other thing is in terms of travel, again, the Chinese had a compass. They also had a fantastic map-making tradition. These, together, the two of them make you think that the next obvious step would be the Chinese to explore and potentially conquer or colonize other parts of the world. In fact, there's actually a brief period in which it does actually appear the Chinese, the Ming Dynasty, is going to do exactly that. And now what we're going to see is this one very famous Chinese traveler known as Genghis Khan. His name starts with a Z. Genghis Khan is someone attached to the Imperial court. He is a eunuch, which someone once put on an exam that he was unique, which is also true. But that's not exactly what eunuch means. Genghis Khan really is chosen by the emperor, one of the Ming emperors, to go ahead and start this very ambitious series of journeys to other territories. This map is actually gives you just one of his expeditions and the many places that he was landing with all these Chinese imperial ships. Which included, as you can see here, again, some of these territories in South Asia, areas in India, some areas in the east coast of Africa, the Arabian Peninsula. All of these actually come in the sphere of this new expedition by Genghis Khan. In fact, this whole expedition goes at an imperial scale. Thousands of sailors are involved, and around 250 ships. Now, one of the things that Genghis Khan does while he's there is he collects a bunch of cool stuff, more or less. So, for instance, the first draft that the Chinese had ever seen comes back with this expedition. Interestingly enough, too, he also will force any local leaders to do the kowtow, to pay homage to the Chinese emperor, and to give him gifts, which in many cases was very strange because you would never see these people again. So they had sworn their loyalty to an emperor who they didn't really know who he was, and they would never see again. But he does force them to do this. This old attitude of the Middle Kingdom is still very much alive on these journeys. Nevertheless, we do think that there were some critics of Genghis Khan back at home, like, why are we spending all this money when we're getting back a bunch of drafts and knickknacks in return? Nevertheless, I really have to stress to you just how what a scale that these journeys were. To give you some idea of just how many men we're talking about, this is actually a mock-up in one museum that gives you some idea of the size of just one of Genghis Khan's vessels. And he had 250 of these. This, by comparison, is one of the ships of Christopher Columbus, and he had 3 of these. So you can get some idea when people say that if the Chinese had really wanted to, they could have been the ones to go out and kill a bunch of natives and colonize the world. They chose not to, however. Many people felt these journeys were a waste of time and money. And Genghis Khan actually doing more or less because he makes enemies of some people at court. Then the emperor decides that he's going to pull the plug entirely on all these expeditions all at once. And in fact, Genghis Khan will die in obscurity. And even worse than that, what ends up happening is that because of this really souring on the outside world, the Chinese emperor will actually decide that he is going to destroy not only Genghis Khan's ships, but he's going to go ahead and he's going to destroy all government vessels in the seas. because he fears that eventually they'll just lead to piracy. The end result of this was that pirates began to come up all over the place around China because there was no one to stop them anymore. The government had basically gotten out of the business of policing the seas around China. So, in essence, this leaves, of course, many historians wondering what would have happened if the huge Chinese emperors had beaten European explorers to the punch, or even if Chinese merchants had been left to their own devices. Because, as I said, now, in fact, the Imperial Chinese government is actively clamping down on merchants and their ships, even further sort of severing the links between China and the rest of the world. The ultimate end result of this is, despite having really a huge head start on most people and other civilizations, China never really capitalizes on its own potential. Really, what's striking is that it's not just in terms of the lack of innovation in, you may say, government or governmental policy. In many other, despite having, again, many of these sort of wonderful features in its golden age, there were features of Chinese civilization that strike us as strikingly pre-modern. So, for instance, in Chinese agriculture, throughout this entire period we've been talking about and far beyond, it's going to rely much more upon human labor than anything else. Certainly not animals or even labor-saving devices. Really, the techniques of agriculture in China are not going to improve significantly. Meaning that the productivity of agriculture will remain strikingly low in China altogether. So really the lives of most Chinese for centuries were little altered in appearance or reality. So most of the things we've been discussing in terms of the government would appear like small blips on the vast majority of Chinese peasants' lives. Most people were desperately poor, they never left their own village. Really, in some ways, even those classes I talked to you about, for instance, when merchants begin to become important, they only really serve a very small slice of Chinese society. And the Chinese continue to think that being a merchant was a disreputable job. That really meant that a lot of people didn't want to become merchants at all or invest money. Really, merchants never at all break the hold of power on people who held land in China, this traditional noble class, which really goes nowhere for the most part. And if anything, too, to add insult to injury, the Chinese government would sometimes place such high taxes on some of those few people who are merchants or artisans that will actually discourage people from going these paths at all. The end result of all of this is that Imperial China had managed to create a system that was so overwhelming that it actually contains change very well and regulates it. So it can keep their traditions alive and strong, but it allowed them no window to be able to develop further. So some people would say, ironically, that the very success of Chinese civilization that leads to a lack of growth. I still have a minute, don't shut up. The goal here was the assurance of continuity. It wasn't, as you might think, that innovation is good. Fundamental change is a good thing. Not every civilization feels that that's the case. The problem, though, that China is going to discover, and this is a problem that we will not talk about in this class as much, but it was actually a genuine shock to the Chinese in the 19th century when Western Europeans began to go to war and carve out spaces of China for merchant activities, and China is almost helpless to be able to stop them. And all of a sudden they recognized the world outside them had actually managed to shoot past them in many ways. This caused a lot of soul searching then in China to how to react to the rest of the world, both getting to our level and then exceeding us. All right, folks, we continue on Friday. Thank you.